She was just a waitress in an upscale New York restaurant, the kind of person no one really notices, yet the one who keeps everything running. Until one ordinary night, the unexpected happened. Gunshots erupted outside, and the target was the son of one of the city's most feared men, Mafia boss Jonathan Cole. Without a second thought, Grace Miller threw herself over the boy, saving his life. The next day, instead of being praised, she was let go with a simple, "We can't take any risks," fired for being brave. A week later, she returned to that same restaurant, not as an employee, but as the new owner. Before you begin, click subscribe and tell me something about where you live. What's the weather like today? Grace Miller had been working at Harper's Steakhouse for several years. It was one of the most elegant and expensive restaurants in New York City, known for its wealthy clients and strict rules. Grace was used to the pressure, handling long shifts, demanding customers, and high expectations from the management. On a cold and rainy night, the restaurant was full as usual. One of the tables near the back was reserved for someone important, Jonathan Cole's son, Ethan. Everyone at the restaurant knew who Jonathan Cole was, a dangerous man with connections to organized crime. His name alone brought fear. Ethan, a quiet boy around 9 years old, was having dinner with 2 bodyguards. Suddenly, loud noises filled the restaurant. Shots were fired through the windows. People screamed and ducked under tables. Grace, who was nearby, didn't stop to think. She rushed forward and threw herself over Ethan, protecting him from the bullets. The gunshots lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like forever. Broken glass was everywhere. Plates had fallen, drinks spilled, and people were still hiding under tables. Grace didn't move until she was sure the danger had passed. When the bodyguards finally reacted and secured the area, they pulled Ethan away and checked him for injuries. He was shaken, but unharmed. Grace had a few cuts on her arms and face, but she was alive. Everyone in the restaurant looked at her, shocked. She had saved the son of the most feared man in the city. A few minutes later, the police arrived. They questioned everyone, especially Grace. She told them what she did, and they wrote down her statement. But the atmosphere had changed. The staff, once friendly, now looked at her with worry and fear. The managers whispered in the corner. Grace noticed their nervous looks and started to feel uneasy. The next morning, Grace was called into her manager's office. She expected to be thanked or even praised for what she did. Instead, the manager looked serious and uncomfortable. He told her that although her actions were brave, the restaurant couldn't keep her employed anymore. He said it was for her own safety, and for the safety of everyone else. Grace was shocked. She had risked her life for a child, and now she was being punished for it. No one offered her help. No one offered her another job or protection. She was handed her last paycheck and asked to leave immediately. Humiliated and confused, Grace packed her things and walked out of the place where she had spent years working hard. She felt alone, like everything she had built was taken away in one night. She had done the right thing, but it didn't seem to matter to anyone. Grace returned to her small apartment in Brooklyn. It wasn't much, just 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a window that looked out onto the street. The rain was still falling, and her clothes were damp from walking home. She sat on her couch, holding the envelope with her final paycheck. The silence in the apartment made her feel even more lost. She had no plan. She didn't know what she would do next. Her savings weren't enough to support her for long. Her phone buzzed with messages from co-workers, some expressing concern, others warning her to be careful. Word was spreading fast. Grace had protected the son of Jonathan Cole, and now people were scared. Some even told her she should leave the city. But Grace didn't understand why. She wasn't involved with criminals. She had only tried to help a child. Still, deep down, she knew her life had just changed forever. What Grace didn't know was that her actions had reached the ears of powerful people. That night, Jonathan Cole had been away on business. When he heard what happened, he demanded every detail. He learned about the attack, how his son was almost killed, and how a restaurant worker, someone he had never met, had risked her life to save Ethan. At first, he was suspicious. He didn't trust easily. But when his men confirmed the story, and he saw the security footage himself, something shifted in him. Jonathan Cole was a man who ruled by fear. He was used to people obeying him, not helping him. But this woman, Grace, had acted with no motive, no warning. She had saved the most important person in his life. He became very interested in her. He wanted to know everything, where she lived, who she was, and what she wanted. And he wanted to meet her. Meanwhile, Grace tried to carry on with her life. She updated her resume and started applying for jobs online. But nothing felt normal anymore. People recognized her on the street. A few reporters showed up outside her building asking questions. She stopped answering her phone. Every sound outside made her jump. She didn't feel safe, even in her own home. A few days later, as she was coming back from the grocery store, she noticed a black car parked near her apartment. She ignored it at first, but it was still there the next morning. Later, someone knocked on her door, a well-dressed man with a serious look. He told her he worked for Jonathan Cole. Grace froze. The man didn't threaten her. He simply said that Mr. Cole wanted to meet her, to thank her in person. Grace didn't know what to say. She had stepped into a world she never wanted to be part of. A few days had passed since the shooting at the restaurant. Grace was trying to stay quiet in her small apartment, avoiding the news and ignoring most of her messages. She hadn't gone back to work, and she didn't have any interviews lined up. Life felt strange. Then, early in the afternoon, a black SUV parked right in front of her building. Grace noticed it from her window. Two large men in suits stepped out of the vehicle. They stood silently by the car for a few minutes, then one of them walked to the front door and knocked. When Grace opened the door, they didn't threaten her or force her. One of them said Mr. Jonathan Cole wanted to see her. Grace didn't answer right away, but after a moment she nodded. They led her to the SUV, opened the door, and told her to sit in the back. The ride was quiet and serious. The drive was long and smooth. The SUV left Brooklyn and headed toward Long Island. Grace didn't say a word. Neither did the men. She looked out the window, watching the city turn into suburbs and then into quiet, expensive neighborhoods. Eventually, the car turned into a long, private driveway. At the end stood a massive mansion with large gates and tall trees. The house was clean, modern, and intimidating. As the car stopped, a third man came out and opened her door. She followed the men up the stone steps and into the house. Everything inside was spotless. Marble floors, tall ceilings, expensive paintings on the walls. The hallway was silent as they led her to a large room with tall windows. There, standing in front of a desk, was Jonathan Cole. He wore a dark suit and had a calm, serious face. He looked powerful, like someone used to getting what he wanted. Jonathan Cole didn't rush. He studied Grace carefully for a few seconds before speaking. His voice was low and steady. He said he knew everything about the night of the shooting. He thanked her for protecting his son and said Ethan hadn't stopped talking about her. Then, without any hesitation, he offered her money, a large amount, as a reward for saving Ethan's life. He told her it was only fair and that he always paid his debts. Grace listened quietly. When he finished, she simply shook her head. She said she didn't want the money. She explained she only did what anyone with a heart would do. Jonathan seemed surprised. He repeated the offer again, even increasing the amount, but Grace refused a second time. The room became quiet. For a man like Jonathan Cole, who was used to buying anything, loyalty, silence, favors, her answer was unusual. He looked at her differently now, not just with curiosity. For a few seconds, Jonathan said nothing. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Grace stood still, trying not to show her nerves. She didn't know what he would do, but instead of getting angry, Jonathan seemed interested. He asked her questions: where she worked before, where she grew up, why she was at the restaurant that night. Grace answered honestly, even though she didn't like talking about herself. She explained her life wasn't easy, and she wasn't looking for trouble. She just happened to be there when it happened. Jonathan listened closely. He didn't interrupt her, and in that moment something shifted. Grace could see that behind the cold and powerful image there was a father, someone who deeply cared about his son. Jonathan didn't smile, but his tone changed. It became softer just for a moment. Grace noticed it, even if he tried to hide it behind his usual serious expression. Jonathan finally stood up and walked over to her. He didn't get too close, but close enough to show he was done pretending. He said she was different from most people he met. She didn't ask for anything, didn't try to take advantage of the situation. He told her he respected that. Grace wasn't sure how to respond. The room was still quiet, but something had changed. There was now a strange connection between them. Not friendship, not trust, but something in between, a kind of mutual respect. Jonathan nodded once and said she was free to go. The guards would take her home. Grace thanked him and turned to leave. Before walking out, she looked back one last time. Jonathan was already back at his desk, but he paused and looked at her again. It was only a second, but that moment stayed with her. Neither of them forgot it. On the ride home, Grace didn't say anything. She kept thinking about everything that had just happened. She had just met one of the most dangerous men in New York, and she had said no to his money. Most people would call her crazy, but she didn't regret it. It wasn't about pride or fear. She just didn't feel right taking something for doing what she thought was natural. Still, the meeting had left an impression on her. Jonathan Cole wasn't what she expected. He was cold, yes, and powerful, but not heartless. There was something human buried beneath all that control. She didn't trust him, but she no longer saw him as just a criminal. Meanwhile, Jonathan sat in his office, reviewing the security footage from the restaurant again. He watched Grace protect his son, again and again. She had become someone he wouldn't forget, and the silent game between them had just begun. After their meeting, Jonathan Cole couldn't stop thinking about Grace. He had met many people in his life, but she was different. He had offered her money twice, and both times she refused. That didn't sit well with him. He wasn't used to people saying no. The next day, he sent one of his men to learn more about her. Within hours, he had a report on her life, where she worked, her rent situation, and what happened after the shooting. When he found out she had been fired from Harper's Steakhouse because of the incident, he was furious. Grace had risked her life to save his son, and instead of being rewarded, she was pushed away. Jonathan didn't like that. He saw it as unfair and stupid. He told his assistant to get the restaurant's owner on the phone. He planned to fix it, but he didn't expect what would happen next. When Grace got the call from Harper's Steakhouse, she was confused. The manager said her job was available again, and she could return as soon as possible. Grace didn't understand. She asked what had changed, but the manager avoided the question. She knew something wasn't right. She hung up and started putting the pieces together. It didn't take long to guess that Jonathan had something to do with it. She was angry. She didn't ask for his help, and she didn't want it. That same afternoon, she went to find him. She didn't wait for an invitation or a call. She went back to the mansion and demanded to speak to him. When Jonathan came to meet her, she didn't hold back. She looked him in the eye and said, "I don't want your pity." Her voice was steady, not scared. Jonathan stood silent for a second. Very few people spoke to him like that. He wasn't sure how to react at first. Most people either feared him or wanted something from him. Grace didn't do either. She was just angry. She told him she didn't want anyone pulling strings for her behind her back. She said she could fight her own battles and didn't need to be rescued. Jonathan listened without interrupting. He respected her more for saying it straight. He could see she wasn't trying to insult him. She just didn't want to feel like a charity case. That hit him harder than he expected. He had spent years building power by giving people things and making them owe him. Grace didn't owe him anything, and she wanted to keep it that way. For the first time, Jonathan saw her pride, and it wasn't selfish. It was her way of staying strong. He nodded and said he understood. Grace turned and walked away, leaving him deep in thought. After she left, the house felt too quiet. Jonathan went to his private office and sat at his desk. He thought about what she said. Her words kept repeating in his mind. It wasn't the rejection that bothered him. It was the honesty. She wasn't trying to impress him or use him. She simply wanted to live her life with dignity. That was rare. Jonathan realized that Grace was one of the only people who had treated him like a man, not like a powerful figure. She didn't try to flatter him. She didn't even show fear. And she didn't care about his influence or wealth. That level of honesty made him uncomfortable, but it also pulled him in. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. It had been a long time since someone made him feel unsure of what to do next. Grace had done that with just a few words. That night, after dinner, Jonathan walked down the hallway to his son's room. He opened the door slowly and looked inside. Ethan was fast asleep, his small hands tucked under his pillow. The room was peaceful. Jonathan stood by the door for a while, watching him. His son had almost died. And if Grace hadn't been there, things could have ended very differently. Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest as he thought about it. He didn't show emotions often, but this moment made him feel something real. He walked closer and gently fixed the blanket on Ethan's bed. Then he sat on the edge of a nearby chair and kept looking at him. As Ethan slept quietly, Jonathan found his mind drifting back to Grace, the woman who had no reason to help them, but did. Not for money, not for favors, just because it was the right thing to do. As he sat in that quiet room, Jonathan felt something strange. It wasn't fear or anger, feelings he knew well. This was different. It was admiration. He admired Grace for her strength, her honesty, and her refusal to be controlled. It wasn't common in his world. People always wanted something. They lied, begged, or played games. But Grace was honest from the start. He also felt curious. He wanted to know more about her, not just her past, but how her mind worked. What made her so different from everyone else? For years, Jonathan had lived in a world full of shadows, deals, and violence. And now, for the first time in a long time, he felt something that pulled him toward the light, a small glimpse of something better. And it came from a woman who had walked into his life by chance. Grace had made her mark. He knew he wouldn't forget her. A few days after Grace visited the mansion, something unexpected happened. Ethan, Jonathan's son, asked to see her again. It wasn't a small request. He brought it up during breakfast, and then again before bed. He told his father that he missed her and wanted to talk to her. Jonathan didn't respond right away. He was surprised. His son wasn't usually so expressive, but over the next few days, Ethan kept asking. He didn't want to go out or see anyone else. He just wanted Grace. Jonathan didn't like people entering his private world, and he wasn't comfortable letting anyone close to Ethan. But this was different. Grace had already proven herself by saving his son. After some thought, Jonathan agreed. He told his assistant to contact Grace and invite her back. The invitation was simple, no pressure, just a visit. When Grace got the message, she hesitated for a moment, then accepted. Grace returned to the mansion, unsure of what to expect. The last time she had been there, things were serious and tense. This time felt different. When she arrived, a housekeeper greeted her and led her to the garden. Ethan was already outside, waiting for her with a book in his hand. When he saw her, he ran toward her with a big smile. Grace knelt down to greet him, and he hugged her tightly. It surprised her how attached he already seemed. They sat together on a bench, and Ethan asked her to read the story to him. Grace opened the book and began reading in a calm voice. As she read, Ethan laughed at the silly parts and asked her questions. From inside the house, Jonathan stood by the window, watching the entire scene. He didn't say anything. He just observed quietly. He had never seen Ethan so happy or so connected to someone else. As the visit continued, Ethan grew more comfortable. He didn't want Grace to leave. When it was time for her to go, he asked if she could come back tomorrow. Grace smiled, but said she wasn't sure. That night, Ethan brought it up again. He told Jonathan he wanted Grace to stay longer next time. Jonathan listened closely. He realized Ethan wasn't just being playful. He truly enjoyed Grace's presence. After thinking it over, Jonathan made a decision. The next day, he invited Grace again, but this time with a proposal. He asked her if she would consider working as Ethan's private tutor. The job would include reading with him, helping with schoolwork, and simply spending time with him. Grace was surprised by the offer. At first, she wasn't sure if it was a good idea, but she thought about her situation. She needed a stable job, and Ethan clearly trusted her. So, she agreed. Her first official day as Ethan's tutor started early. Grace arrived at the mansion and was shown to a bright room filled with books, toys, and a large table for lessons. Ethan was excited to see her again and quickly pulled her over to show her some drawings he had made. They began their routine, going over school assignments, practicing reading, and even playing simple games as part of learning. Grace stayed focused on the job. She didn't let herself think too much about the house or Jonathan. But every once in a while, she would catch him walking by, watching silently. Over the days, Grace began noticing changes in the house. Staff members seemed more relaxed around her. Ethan became more cheerful, and Jonathan, though still quiet, started speaking to her a little more. He asked how Ethan was doing, what he liked, and what she thought of his progress. The conversations were short, but sincere. The days turned into weeks. Grace continued working with Ethan, and their bond grew stronger. He opened up about things that made him nervous, shared his favorite memories, and asked endless questions. Grace answered everything with patience. She wasn't just a tutor anymore. She had become a real part of Ethan's life. Meanwhile, Jonathan watched this transformation closely. He saw how his son had changed. The boy who used to stay quiet during meals now talked more and even laughed at the table. Grace's presence was changing the atmosphere of the house. Jonathan also started spending more time nearby, listening to the stories Grace told or watching them from the doorway. At first, he stayed silent, but slowly he began sitting down for a few minutes during lessons. Grace noticed, but she didn't comment. She just kept doing her job. The three of them started falling into a rhythm that felt natural. As Grace spent more time in the mansion, she began to see things from a new perspective. She had assumed Jonathan was only a cold and powerful man running a dangerous business, but living close to him showed something else. He wasn't just a crime boss. He was a father trying to protect his child. He was careful, always alert, and clearly carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Grace started to understand the pressure he lived under. She saw how much he cared for Ethan, even if he didn't always show it in words. The way he checked in, the way he stayed close during lessons, the way he looked at his son when he wasn't being watched. All of it showed love, even if it was quiet. Grace didn't say anything out loud, but something was changing inside her. She no longer saw Jonathan Cole as just a dangerous man. Over the following weeks, Grace began noticing more about Jonathan than she had before. She arrived early each day, worked with Ethan, and sometimes stayed a little longer to help with dinner or talk with the staff. It was during one of those quiet evenings, when Ethan had gone to bed, that Jonathan joined her outside on the back porch. It was late, and the house was calm. For the first few minutes, they sat in silence. Then Jonathan slowly started talking. He didn't give too many details at first, but Grace listened carefully. He spoke about his past, not about business or money, but about his wife. She had died years ago. Someone had killed her, and Jonathan still carried that pain. Grace didn't ask many questions. She just let him speak. For Jonathan, opening up was rare. But something about Grace made him feel like he could finally say things out loud. Their late-night conversations continued. Sometimes they only lasted a few minutes, sometimes longer. Slowly, Jonathan shared more. He told her about the pressure he felt every day, running the empire, keeping Ethan safe, and making sure no one saw his weak moments. He said he hadn't really slept in years. Grace started to see the man behind the title. She realized that Jonathan's silence wasn't coldness, it was exhaustion. She told him that pretending to be made of steel didn't make him strong. One night, after a long pause, he admitted that he was tired of pretending. Grace told him she didn't pity him, but she believed he could be more than what he had become. He looked at her for a long time and didn't say anything. But that night, he didn't go back inside right away. He stayed with her on the porch until the sky began to turn grey. As the days passed, the bond between them grew stronger. Grace didn't plan for it to happen. She had accepted the job for stability and nothing more. But she couldn't ignore what was happening. Jonathan wasn't just her employer anymore. He was opening up to her, trusting her, and showing her sides of himself no one else got to see. She caught herself thinking about him outside of work. She noticed the way he looked at her when she laughed with Ethan. Sometimes she noticed how close they stood when they spoke. But more than anything, she saw how he had started to change. He was softer with Ethan. He listened more. He even laughed, something she had never seen from him before. Grace didn't know what to do with the feelings building inside her. She reminded herself who he was, a powerful and dangerous man. But her heart was starting to ignore that fact. One night, Jonathan asked her to stay a little longer. Ethan had already gone to bed, and the two of them ended up back on the porch. This time, he talked more about his wife. Her name was Isabella. She was kind, strong, and everything he wasn't. When she died, something inside him shut off. He had tried to fill that empty space with control, power, and fear, but none of it worked. Grace sat quietly, listening as he described the guilt he felt. For not protecting Isabella, for becoming someone she wouldn't recognize, for raising Ethan in a dangerous world. Grace didn't offer empty comfort. She didn't say everything would be okay. She just told him that pain doesn't go away, but people can still change. Her words hit something deep inside him. Jonathan wasn't used to being seen as a person, but with Grace, he felt real. He felt human again. What scared both of them the most was how natural it felt to be near each other. Jonathan had built walls around himself for years. Grace had learned to protect her heart to survive, but now those walls were cracking. Sometimes she would find him waiting near the kitchen when she arrived, just to say good morning. Sometimes she would stay later, just to hear how his day went. They didn't talk about what was happening between them, but it was there, in the silence, in the glances, in the way they moved around each other. Grace tried to stay focused. She told herself that feelings could only make things harder, but the more she tried to ignore it, the more it grew. And Jonathan, for the first time in years, started to feel something like peace. It came in small moments with her, quiet, honest, and completely different from the life he knew. By now, the connection between them was undeniable. Grace couldn't deny what she felt anymore. But she also knew what kind of world Jonathan belonged to. It wasn't safe, and it didn't have room for mistakes. Every choice mattered. She often lay awake at night, torn between what her heart wanted and what her mind warned her against. Jonathan, on the other hand, wasn't confused. He knew how he felt. He didn't say the words out loud, but his actions were clear. He was drawn to her. She was the only one who challenged him, who made him think about his choices, who treated him like a person, not a boss, not a criminal, but a man. And that meant more to him than anything he owned. Their bond was growing stronger each day, and even though it was dangerous, even though it was complicated, neither of them could stop it anymore. Everything changed the night the Marcellos attacked. Jonathan's empire had many enemies, but the Marcellos were the most dangerous. They had been quiet for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That night, while Grace was helping Ethan with homework in the study room of the mansion, loud noises came from outside. At first, it sounded like something falling, then shouting, then gunshots. Jonathan's security team rushed through the halls, giving orders. Jonathan himself burst into the room, telling Grace to take Ethan and stay in the panic room. But before they could reach it, the door to the hallway exploded open. Two masked men grabbed Grace and Ethan and pulled them away while the guards were distracted. Grace screamed and fought, but they were too strong. In seconds, they were gone. The Marcellos had planned everything. They didn't want money. They wanted to break Jonathan, and they knew exactly how to do it. Grace and Ethan were taken to an old warehouse on the edge of the city. It was cold, dark, and smelled like oil and rust. The place had no windows, only one door, and broken lights hanging from the ceiling. They were locked in a small room with concrete walls. Grace held Ethan close, trying to stay calm for his sake. She told him everything would be okay, even though she wasn't sure. The men guarding them came in a few times, checking on them, laughing, making threats. Grace never showed fear in front of Ethan. When they tried to scare the boy, she stood in front of him like a shield. Her body ached, her hands were shaking, but she didn't back down. Ethan cried quietly, holding her arm. Grace whispered to him to stay quiet and trust her. No one was coming right now, but she knew Jonathan. He would never stop looking for them. Back at the mansion, Jonathan was losing control. His men gave him the bad news. Grace and Ethan had been taken. For the first time in years, he felt real fear, not for his own life, but for theirs. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. He gave orders quickly and clearly, but his hands were clenched. He sent his best men to track the Marcellos, called in favors, paid for information. Hours passed. Every minute felt like a lifetime. When they finally found out where Grace and Ethan were being held, Jonathan didn't wait. He grabbed a weapon and joined the rescue team himself. His advisors begged him not to go, but he ignored them. This wasn't business anymore. This was personal. He knew it was a trap, but he didn't care. He couldn't let them be hurt. He would face bullets, death, anything. Grace and Ethan were all that mattered now. He had already lost too much. The warehouse was guarded and ready for a fight. Jonathan's team arrived just before sunrise. There was no negotiation. Bullets flew across the building as the two sides clashed. Inside the room, Grace covered Ethan with her body when the first shots rang out. She could hear men yelling, the sound of gunfire echoing everywhere. Then the door burst open. Jonathan stepped in, bleeding from his arm, but alive. His face was full of fury and desperation. He shot the last guard standing in their way and rushed toward them. Grace stood up quickly, grabbing Ethan and pulling him into Jonathan's arms. Jonathan held them both for a second, checking to make sure they were okay. Grace had cuts and bruises, but she was alive. Ethan was shaking but unharmed. Jonathan pulled them close and told them it was over. He didn't say much, but his eyes said everything. He had come for them, no matter the cost. They escaped before the police arrived. Jonathan's men covered their tracks. Back at the mansion, doctors treated Jonathan's wound. Grace refused to leave his side. Ethan sat beside him, not letting go of his hand. The adrenaline had passed, but the emotions remained. Grace kept replaying the rescue in her head, how he had charged into danger for them, how he didn't hesitate. Jonathan could have stayed safe and sent others, but he chose to come himself. That changed everything. She looked at him now, not just as a dangerous man with a cold heart, but as someone capable of love, real love. The way he had looked at her in that moment, desperate, scared, relieved, showed a side of him she had never seen. She had risked her life for his son. Now he had risked his life for her. That kind of bond didn't go away. It grew stronger with every passing second. That night changed everything. Jonathan was no longer just Grace's employer, and she was no longer just Ethan's tutor. Something much deeper had formed between them. Grace sat beside Jonathan as he rested, and she held his hand. He didn't speak much, but his hand squeezed hers gently, and she understood. There were no promises, no declarations, but something had shifted permanently. They had crossed a line. Outside, the world would never approve of them. Jonathan was still the head of a criminal empire. Grace was still a woman who wanted a normal life, but inside that mansion, none of that mattered. They had faced death together. They had protected each other. Now they couldn't imagine being apart. Ethan had already accepted her as family. And Grace, though scared of what it all meant, knew her heart had made its choice. From that night forward, whatever came next, they would face it together, no matter the consequences. Back at the mansion, things weren't the same. After the rescue, everything felt heavier. The house was quiet, and the tension between Jonathan and Grace had changed. They still shared looks and quiet moments, but something was off. One morning, Grace walked into the kitchen and found Jonathan sitting alone, staring at nothing. When she asked if he was okay, he avoided the question. Later that day, he told her they needed to talk. She followed him to his office, and he closed the door behind them. He didn't look at her right away. Then he said, "You shouldn't be here anymore. It's too dangerous. I can't protect you from everything." Grace stood in silence, confused and hurt. He told her it was better if she left now, before things got worse, but Grace didn't back down. She looked him in the eye and said, "I'm not walking away just because things are hard." Most people in his life backed off when things got complicated. They followed orders or disappeared when he pushed them away. But Grace wasn't like them. She stood her ground. "You told me everything would change after the night at the warehouse," she said. "So why are you giving up now?" Jonathan stayed quiet. He wasn't angry, just torn. He had spent years building walls around himself, and now he didn't know how to let them down. Grace stepped closer. "You love me," she said calmly, "and I love you. That's real. Don't pretend it's not." Jonathan finally looked at her. He saw no fear in her eyes, just honesty. And that's when he realized he couldn't push her away anymore. It wasn't just about danger, it was about being brave enough to live differently. And he didn't want to lose the one thing that finally made him feel whole. The next day, Jonathan made a decision. He gathered his most trusted men and told them something they never expected to hear. He was stepping away from the business. At first, no one reacted. Then, some looked angry. Others just confused. "I'm done," he said. "No more deals, no more violence. I want out." One of his oldest associates called him a traitor. Another warned him that walking away wasn't possible, but Jonathan didn't care. He had made up his mind. He explained he didn't want Ethan to grow up in a world full of guns and lies. He wanted a clean life, a normal life, something real, something peaceful. Grace stood by the door during that meeting, watching silently. She didn't speak, but Jonathan could feel her support. He wasn't afraid of his enemies. He had faced worse, but walking away from the only life he had known, that was the hardest thing he'd ever done. News of Jonathan's decision spread fast. Some members of the Mafia cut ties with him immediately, calling him weak. Others respected him more than ever, even if they didn't understand his choice. They saw it as a bold move, maybe even honorable. He wasn't running away. He was facing everything head-on. In the following weeks, Jonathan started shutting things down. He sold off assets, cancelled old contracts, and cut off dangerous connections. Every step was risky, but Grace was always there, helping with the process when she could, and encouraging him when things got tough. Ethan noticed the change too. He asked more questions and listened carefully to his father's answers. Jonathan didn't hide anything from him anymore. One night after dinner, Ethan hugged him and said, "I'm proud of you, Dad." Jonathan didn't say anything back right away, but that moment meant more than any business deal he had ever made. The mansion, once filled with tension and guarded men, started to feel different. It was still big and serious, but there was more peace inside. Grace continued her work with Ethan, but now they also spent more time as a family. They ate meals together, watched movies, and talked about the future. Jonathan had changed. He still carried the weight of his past, but he wasn't cold anymore. He laughed more. He slept better. He held Grace's hand without hesitation. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a home. Grace could see the difference in his eyes. He still had scars, both inside and out, but he wasn't hiding anymore. He was becoming the man she believed he could be. And every time he looked at her, she knew she made the right choice by staying. They weren't perfect, but they were moving forward, step by step. Jonathan stood by the window one morning, watching Ethan play in the yard. Grace walked up behind him and leaned on the doorframe. "You did it," she said. He turned to face her. "Not yet," he replied, "but I'm getting there." He reached out and pulled her closer. They stood in silence, just watching Ethan laugh and run across the grass. For Jonathan, this wasn't just a new chapter. It was a new life. He had lost people, made mistakes, and lived in darkness for too long. But now, with Grace by his side and Ethan safe, he believed in something again. He didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't pretending. He had chosen a new path, and he wasn't walking it alone. With Grace's love and Ethan's trust, Jonathan truly believed that a different life was finally possible. Late at night, long after Grace and Ethan had gone to sleep, Jonathan sat alone in his office. The house was quiet. The hallway lights were off, and most of the staff had already gone home. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, holding a pen in one hand and staring at a stack of documents on his desk. These weren't business contracts or financial records. These were ownership papers. He had made his decision days ago. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't emotional. It was something he needed to do. He picked up the first form, an official document transferring Harper's Steakhouse into Grace's name. Everything would be legal, clean, and complete. No hidden ties, no tricks. He had arranged everything through a lawyer he trusted. Grace didn't know about it. Jonathan didn't want her to feel pressured. This was a gift, yes, but more than that, it was his way of saying thank you and goodbye. When the paperwork was complete, Jonathan placed it in a sealed folder along with a handwritten letter. He looked at it for a few seconds, then carefully placed the envelope in a drawer. He stood up, walked across the room, and looked around one last time. The office had always been a place where he made hard decisions. Tonight was no different, but this time he wasn't planning a deal or settling a score. He was walking away, not because he was weak, but because he finally understood what mattered. Before leaving, he checked on Ethan, who was fast asleep, then quietly stepped into the guest room where Grace had been staying. He didn't wake her. He didn't speak. He just stood there for a moment, watching her breathe. Then he turned around and left. No goodbye. No noise. By the time morning came, Jonathan Cole had disappeared. No phone call, no message, no warning. Grace woke up early and followed her normal routine. She made breakfast for Ethan, checked his schedule, and waited for Jonathan to join them like usual. But he didn't come. Hours passed. She asked one of the house staff if he had gone out, but no one knew anything. His phone went straight to voicemail. His car was still in the garage. His room was untouched. At first, Grace thought maybe he was working on something private, maybe a final meeting or a legal process. But as the day dragged on, the silence became harder to ignore. That afternoon, the family lawyer showed up at the house. He gave Grace an envelope and said Jonathan had left instructions. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter in his handwriting. It read, "You saved me twice, from death and from myself. This is my way of thanking you. Live free. Be happy." She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, and cried for the first time in days. It wasn't just sadness, it was confusion, pain, and a deep sense of loss. Jonathan was gone, and no one knew where he went. He had vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but his words and a legal transfer of ownership. The documents were clear. Harper's Steakhouse now belonged to her. The restaurant where her life had fallen apart had now been given back to her, not as a job, but as a legacy. Grace didn't care about the business in that moment. All she wanted was to see him walk through the door. She wanted to ask him why he left without saying goodbye, why he didn't believe she deserved a choice in the matter. But she knew him well enough to understand this was his way of protecting her. New York didn't stop for anyone. The city moved on as if nothing had happened. The streets stayed busy, the news kept spinning, the restaurants opened on time. But for Grace, everything felt slower, heavier. She showed up at Harper's Steakhouse 1 week later, not as a waitress, but as the new owner. The staff was surprised but supportive. Many remembered what had happened months ago. She made quiet changes, improved working conditions, and made the place warmer. Still, every time she walked into the kitchen or looked at the front table where Ethan once sat, her chest tightened. At night, when the lights were off and she sat alone in her apartment, she read Jonathan's letter again. Sometimes she thought he might come back, that he was just hiding, watching from a distance. But the days kept passing and he never returned. Grace tried to smile through it, but the pain stayed. She kept the letter in her drawer, folded and slightly worn from being read so many times. Grace didn't know where Jonathan had gone. Maybe he left the country. Maybe he started a new life somewhere quiet. Maybe he was doing what he thought was best. Whatever the reason, she had to respect it. That didn't mean it hurt any less. Ethan asked about his father sometimes, but Grace gave simple answers. He loves you. He always will. She focused on giving Ethan a stable life. She worked hard at the restaurant, paid the bills, and stayed close to the people who mattered. Still, a part of her heart felt unfinished. Jonathan had changed her life in ways no one else ever had. He had given her freedom, trust, and love, even if it came at a cost. She never said goodbye, but deep down she knew. He had said everything in that letter. 1 week had passed since Grace received Jonathan's letter and the official documents. The pain of his disappearance was still fresh, but life had to keep moving. One morning, she got a phone call from the lawyer who had handled the transfer. He asked her to come to Harper's Steakhouse at noon. She didn't ask many questions. She just agreed. When she arrived, she was surprised to see a crowd gathered. Former co-workers, some current staff, and even a few regular customers were there. They weren't working or eating. They were waiting. The atmosphere felt different. People whispered and glanced at her as she walked in. At the center of the room stood the lawyer, holding a stack of papers. He greeted her calmly, then cleared his throat and asked for everyone's attention. Grace stood still, unsure of what was going on. Then he began to read from the top page, slowly and clearly. The lawyer's voice echoed through the room as he read the official statement. As of this date, full ownership and legal rights to Harper's Steakhouse are transferred to Grace Miller. For a moment, there was silence. Grace didn't react at first. Her eyes stayed on the floor, trying to process the words. Then she looked up and saw faces staring back at her, some in shock, some smiling. The lawyer handed her the signed documents and stepped back. Someone in the room clapped. Then another person joined in. The applause grew louder until it filled the entire restaurant. Grace's hands shook as she held the papers. The same place that once let her go without hesitation, out of fear, not loyalty, was now hers. She took a step back, overwhelmed by everything. Her heart was racing. A few people came forward to hug her. Others stood in place, simply watching with respect and admiration. Grace's emotions caught up with her all at once. She felt like she couldn't breathe. Tears formed in her eyes, and she tried to blink them away, but it didn't work. One of the waitresses handed her a tissue, and Grace took it with a quiet thank you. She hadn't expected this moment. Owning a restaurant had never been part of her plan. But this wasn't just any restaurant. This was where everything had started. This was the place she had worked for years, the place where she had once stood behind the bar, serving drinks, taking orders, and following every rule. This was the place where she had protected a child during a shooting, only to be fired days later. And now, it was hers. She didn't feel angry anymore. She didn't want revenge. She just felt full of emotion, full of memories, full of something that felt like closure. Some of the ex-employees came over to greet her. A few said they were sorry for how things had happened in the past. Grace didn't hold any grudges. She knew they had been scared back then, just like the managers were. Fear made people act in ways they later regretted. She smiled at them, nodding, telling them it was okay. Some offered to return if she ever needed help running the place. Grace thanked them and said she'd keep it in mind. A few customers came up and shook her hand, remembering the news story from months ago. "You were the one who saved the boy," one woman said. "You deserve this." Grace didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded again. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but today she couldn't avoid it. This was a day she would never forget. Everything had come full circle in the most unexpected way. Later that afternoon, after most people had gone, Grace stayed behind. She walked through the restaurant slowly, stopping to touch tables, chairs, and old photos still hanging on the walls. Everything looked the same, but now it felt different. This place wasn't just a job anymore. It was hers. Every tile, every menu, every memory. She sat down at the same corner table where she had first met Ethan. She closed her eyes and thought about him, about his smile, and about Jonathan. She didn't know where he was or if he would ever return, but she felt his presence in every part of this decision. He had given her more than a building. He had given her a chance to build something new with her own hands. She promised herself she would honor it. This restaurant would not just survive, it would grow. She would make sure of it, starting now. As the evening approached, Grace turned off the lights and locked the doors. She stood outside for a few moments, looking at the sign above the entrance. Harper's Steakhouse. The same name, but a new chapter. The city around her didn't stop. Cars passed, people walked by, businesses stayed open. But inside her something had shifted. She had been a waitress, a protector, a survivor, and now an owner. The path hadn't been easy. There had been loss, danger, heartbreak, but also love, courage, and second chances. As she walked away from the building, Grace felt proud, not because of what she had received, but because of what she had earned. The woman who once got fired for doing the right thing now held the keys to the place that let her go. And that, more than anything, was proof that her story was just getting started on her own terms. Late at night, after the last table had been cleaned and the lights inside the restaurant were dimmed, Grace stood behind the counter doing the final checks. The staff had already gone home, and she was alone in the quiet space. It had become her routine to stay after closing, checking the books, wiping down surfaces, and just sitting in silence for a while before locking up. The place now felt like a part of her, not just a business, but a home filled with memories. She walked over to the front door to flip the sign to closed, but as she reached for it, Something outside caught her attention. A shadow moved near the entrance. She tensed for a second, unsure of what to expect. Then the figure stepped forward under the streetlight. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Jonathan, and right beside him, holding his hand, was Ethan. Grace opened the door slowly, not sure if she was dreaming. Jonathan looked different, thinner, quieter, but his eyes were the same. He didn't say anything at first, neither did she. They just stared at each other for a moment. Then Grace stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. She held him tightly, and he didn't let go. Ethan smiled beside them and quietly said, "Hi." Grace knelt down and hugged him too. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Not yet. They all stepped inside together. Jonathan looked around the restaurant, scanning the walls, the tables, the floor. "You did it," he said, his voice soft but full of meaning. Grace nodded. "You're really here?" she asked. Jonathan answered, "I'm here, and I'm not going back to that life. It's over." He had finished everything, settled every debt, and cut every tie. The past was behind him, for good. They sat down at a booth near the window, just the three of them. The restaurant was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The city lights flickered through the glass, casting reflections across the floor. Grace looked at them both, Jonathan and Ethan, sitting there like nothing else in the world mattered. She wanted to ask 100 questions, but none of them seemed important now. All that mattered was that they were safe, together, and finally free. Jonathan explained how he spent months quietly closing off everything. No violence, no revenge, just carefully disappearing from the world he once ruled. He had used the time to protect Ethan, to make sure no one would ever come after them again. "I couldn't come back until it was really over," he said. "Now it is." Grace believed him. For the first time, she felt no fear in his words. They stayed in that booth for a long time, not rushing anything. Grace made tea in the kitchen and brought it out in 3 mismatched mugs. Ethan talked about school, books he liked, and how weird it felt to travel so much. Grace listened, smiling, her heart full. Jonathan sat quietly watching them both. He didn't speak often, but he looked content, peaceful. The weight he had carried for so long seemed lighter now. Grace could see it in his posture, in the way he looked at Ethan, and in how he looked at her. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. They were just a small family, sitting in a restaurant late at night, sharing a quiet moment. It was simple, honest, and it felt right. Grace reached across the table and held Jonathan's hand. He looked at her and gave a small nod. They didn't need to say anything else. Eventually, they walked together to the front of the restaurant. Outside, the streets of New York moved as usual, cars passing, people heading home, lights changing. But something was different now. Above the door, a new sign glowed in soft white light. It read, "Grace's Place." The name had been changed just a few days ago, but tonight it meant more than ever. It wasn't just a name. It was a statement, a reminder of everything she had been through, the fear, the sacrifice, the strength, and the love. She looked up at the sign with pride. Jonathan saw it too and smiled faintly. "Perfect name," he said. Ethan nodded in agreement. Grace turned the sign on the door from closed to open, not for customers, but as a symbol. A new chapter had started, one built on trust, on second chances, and on love that didn't ask for anything in return. They stood there for a while, the three of them, looking out at the city that had shaped their story. So much had happened, good and bad, painful and beautiful. But now they were together. No more running, no more hiding. Grace felt the calm settle inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Jonathan had walked away from a world most people never escaped, and he came back, not for power, not for control, but for love, for family, for her. Grace, once just a waitress trying to survive, now owned the very place that had once rejected her, and beside her were the two people who had changed her life forever. As they turned off the lights and locked the door behind them, she knew this was no longer the end of the story. It was the real beginning, a place they could call home, built on courage, love, and a future finally within reach. And that's a wrap. I'm so glad you stayed with us all the way to the end. Thank you so much for watching. Let us know in the comments what you thought of the story, and tell us which part you liked the most or the least. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. See you in the next one.